All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Fed Listens event here at the New York Fed. I'm John Williams. I'm the President and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you for this event. I really appreciate everyone taking time out of their very busy schedules, coming together to help, quite honestly, help us at the Federal Reserve on this important work we're doing, and just double down on how impressive a group we're able to get together. Again, appreciate everybody's efforts to help us, as I said, serve our communities, our nation's economy. Really, and I'd like to welcome those who are watching via webcast. This is the fourth event we've held here at the New York Fed this year as part of a broader effort across the Federal Reserve System, across the United States, as part of what we call the Fed Listens Tour. The first three events that we held in New York in the second district were with our advisory groups. So we have advisory groups with small business, community, other leaders, and members of the community from across the second district. And we asked them the same set of questions we're going to talk about today, and we had a really rich and vibrant discussion about what does it mean when the Fed says we have this dual mandate of maximum employment and price stability. So what's that mean for you? What's it mean for your business? What's it mean for your community? What's it mean for the employees? And the conversations went in a lot of different directions, and I thought, again, we learned a lot, and I think it really helped all of us think deeper, more carefully about these issues, and also kind of think about them as we move forward in thinking about our strategy and our framework issues. Looking at the topics that came up, and I'm guessing they're going to come up again today, a lot of it was really about the difference between the behavior, the state of the aggregate economy. The unemployment rate is 3.6%, and isn't that good? And people say, well, yes, it's good for the economy, but what is it like in my community? What's it like for the people with lower or moderate incomes? What's it mean in terms of the cost of living and housing and affordability? What's it mean more broadly for the experience or the lack of shared prosperity in our country? And a lot of those discussions, I think, not only helped us think about this, but also informed a lot of the work we do in trying to understand not only the big aggregate picture, but also how that picture is different across the communities, across the regions, across sectors. We also talked a lot about what does it mean when we talk about price stability, and depending on whether you remember the days when inflation was 10 or 15% versus people who have kind of take for granted that maybe inflation hasn't been around for a long time. So again, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us in this ongoing conversation and listening for us to help us succeed in our work. And I'm going to now turn the mic over to Rich Clarida, the Vice Chair of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. And Rich has been very bravely and very successfully leading this effort across the country for the Federal Reserve over the last 6 months and continue into next year. So please, Rich, give us your comments.
Thank you very much, President Williams. I'm pleased to attend this Fed Listens event that will provide a New York Second District perspective for the Fed's review of our monetary policy strategy, tools, and communications practices. We are bringing open minds to this review, and we are seeking a broad range of perspectives. It simply seems like good institutional practice to engage with a wide range of interested individuals and groups as part of what on our end is a comprehensive approach to enhance transparency and accountability. Importantly, the Congress of the U.S. has charged the Federal Reserve with achieving a dual mandate of maximum employment and price stability, and this review will take that mandate as given. We will also take as given that a 2% rate of inflation in the PCE price index is the operational goal most consistent with our price stability mandate. Now, let me emphasize that while we believe that our existing strategies and tools and practices have served the public well, we're eager to evaluate ways that they might be improved. The U.S. economy is operating at or close to our maximum employment and price stability goals, at least as we measure them using the aggregate data. And so now is an opportune time to undertake this review. We want to ensure that we continue to meet our statutory goals in coming years. In addition, we will evaluate new policy tools and enhance communication practices that the Federal Reserve and other central banks have deployed in recent years. The U.S. economy and foreign economies have evolved significantly over the last decade. Perhaps most importantly, neutral real interest rates have fallen in the U.S. And abroad. The neutral rate's roughly the rate that's consistent with full employment and price stability. And a lot of this has been documented in fine work that John Williams and co-authors have done over the years. This decline in neutral rates is expected to persist for years, and it likely reflects several factors, including demographics and a slowdown in technology growth. These factors are highly uncertain, but irrespective of their precise roles, the policy implications of a decline in global interest rates are important. All else being equal, a fall in neutral rates increases the likelihood that the Fed or any central bank's policy rate will reach its effective lower bound in a future downturn. And that could make it more difficult for the Fed to provide accommodative policy to support household spending, employment, and keep inflation from falling too low. Another key development in recent decades is that inflation appears less responsive to resource slack, implying a change in the dynamic relationship between inflation and employment. And, of course, this is important to us since oftentimes we need to think about making the appropriate policy decisions in that context. Finally, the strengthening of the labor market in recent years has highlighted the challenges of assessing the proximity of the overall labor market to full employment. The unemployment rate, which stood at 3.6% in April, has been interpreted by many observers as suggesting that the labor market is operating beyond full employment. However, and we remind ourselves of this, the level of unemployment consistent with full employment is not directly observable, and it changes over time. And the range of plausible estimates likely extends at least as low as 4% or perhaps lower. For example, in the March Blue Chip Economic Outlook survey of economists, the average estimate of the structural rate of unemployment for the bottom 10 respondents was 3.9% compared to 4.7% for the highest 10. So even among experts, there's a range of views on this. The decline in the unemployment rate has also been accompanied by a pronounced increase in labor force participation, especially for prime-age workers, and that's also another factor that we need to keep in mind. And, of course, we are also reminded that the strong job gains in recent years have delivered benefits to groups that have historically been disadvantaged in the labor market. For example, African Americans and Hispanics have experienced persistently higher unemployment rates than whites for many decades. However, those unemployment gaps have narrowed as the labor market has strengthened, and there is some indication of an extra benefit to these groups as the unemployment rate moves into very low territory. We've also seen wage increases in the past several years, and have been encouraged to see that some of the strongest gains in recent years have been to the less educated workers and those at the lower end of the wage distribution. So let me conclude with just a couple of comments on the process. So the monetary policy review will have several components. The Federal Reserve Board and the reserve banks are holding these Fed Listens events, and indeed by the end of the year, all 12 of our reserve banks will hold these events. And in these events, we are in listening mode, and we're going to be hearing from a broad range of perspectives. Next month in June, the Federal Reserve System is holding a research conference in Chicago as part of this effort. And then building on all these perspectives and concluding, and based upon staff analysis, the Federal Open Market Committee will perform its own assessment of how our monetary framework might be improved, and we expect to make our conclusions public in the first half of 2020. So thank you, and I very much look forward to this event. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Jack Good. I'll be playing the role of moderator. You've received the questions in advance. We'd like to make sure we get everybody's perspective as well as we get through the main topic areas. Rather than do a round table where everybody is going to chime in, I'd like to facilitate this a little bit more. If you have I'm going to pose the question. If you have something that you want to share, please get my attention, raise your hand, or otherwise, please don't throw anything at me, though. Appreciate that. So we'll start with the first question. really on the overall. How important are the Fed's two statutory goals, the dual mission, maximum employment and price stability? And do any of you have thoughts on whether one is more important than the other, and if so, why? Would anybody like to kick off this part of the discussion? Yes, Mr. Spriggs.
Thank you. And thank you, John, for convening us and bringing this together, and Vice Chair Clarida for coming. I think the Fed has not been fair to the public. Your interpretation of your dual mandate comes from the Full Employment Act. It does not come from the Price Stability Act. What the Full Employment Act, its intention from Congress was full employment. The dual mandate is because the Full Employment Act had what I would call common sense. So it says to fiscal authorities, full employment, but don't run the deficit through the ceiling. I can get you full employment if you want me to ignore deficits and just go out and hire everybody. To the Fed, with monetary policy, full employment, but don't run inflation through the roof. The price stability wasn't a mandate. It's use common sense. Don't run the economy into the ground and making this trade-off. If you look at the period after 1980, when the Fed feels that it reached some golden age in which it achieved price stability, this is very true. Variance in prices have been very narrow, as was mentioned in opening comments. John, you mentioned, everybody is fairly used to inflation not getting much above 2%. Most millennials don't even know about, if you tell them inflation was once 5 or 6%, they don't understand this. But what millennials don't get is what the labor market looked like before. So before the 1980s, it was very rare for the American worker to be in a labor market where the unemployment was above 6%. Post-1980, this is common. So I think you got the speed traps wrong. Just as I could get you unemployment at 0, but inflation at 25%, if you get me inflation at 2%, but get unemployment at 12, this is not balancing out the issues. It's quite easy to stay at 2% if you don't care what the unemployment rate is. So I think the Fed has to think about, for the health of the economy, and look at this from that lens. If you look at the post-1980 period, labor share has declined, productivity has declined, investment in capital has declined. None of the other good things have happened. Are these things that would lead to sustainable growth? The level of inequality has risen. That doesn't seem to lead to stable growth. The share of the economy that goes to finance has grown tremendously. And like I say, finance people, you move money from savers to good investment. You're a truck driver. You're the Brinks driver of money. That doesn't mean you get to take the money out the back of the truck. You should be very efficient about doing it. Finance should not be a bigger part of the sector any more than transportation has grown. Efficiency in transportation has driven it down. Agriculture has become efficient. It's driven it down. Finance should be efficient in an age of big data, artificial intelligence. It should not be growing. So I think the Fed has to think, what role have we played by overplaying price stability and creating these other underlying things? Are they simply a weird bad luck correlation for 35 years, 40 years? Have you been that unlucky and the correlation just runs that way? Or are you actually part of the cause? And I think that's what your exercise needs to look at, whether all of these bad things are correlated with over pursuing price stability.
Thank you. Yes, please. We'll come over here and then. Can you please turn on your mic? Make sure to turn on your mic, please. The microphone, sorry.
Just to kind of add on what we just said, I think the Fed's dual mandate, I think on the price stability side, it kind of makes sense because monetary policy, money supply, all that, I think lends to itself towards the current tools. I think when it comes to the full employment, I think full employment is kind of general. And how does the Fed address the issue of that? And I think it has to kind of redefine its definition of what full employment is. At least from my perspective, when I think of full employment, I just don't think about the U3. It's been so low, but if you feel what people are kind of thinking and just what's the sense that they're going through, even with the 3.6 unemployment rate, they're still kind of uneasy. So I think with the dual mandate on the full employment side, I think we have to kind of focus more on quality jobs, higher paying jobs. I think access to affordable health care within those jobs. I think we also have to think about access to quality education, livable wages, not minimum wages, I think are important as well. And I think the biggest key, I think, why the Fed is kind of in this situation, I think it has to do with the income inequality. And I think it's research has shown that levels of income inequality hinder policymaking, and especially hinder policymaking from the inflation side. When you have such low labor share and this unevenness between profit share and labor share, then if you look at the Phillips curve, which looks at the pressure on wages to kind of push up inflation, when there's no upward movement in workers' wages, how are you going to have upward movement on pressure and inflation? So I think trying to kind of define the full employment side, especially in today's society, I think it should focus more on that side as far as just kind of breaking down what full employment is. It's not the U3. I think it's what it represents under the U3.
Yeah, let me start by thanking the Federal Reserve Bank and President Williams for their leadership in bringing new angles, new initiatives to Puerto Rico. One of those is the CODEFI progression model. So that's a new creature in the field, and we do hope that that will be a game changer in terms of communicating what communities in Puerto Rico can contribute to reduce the unemployment rate in the island. As you may know, the unemployment in Puerto Rico triples the maximum rate of unemployment in the U.S. It hovers around 9.6. So one of the challenges is how do we develop strategies to generate employment from within the island? So that's one major challenge. Access to capital is decisively one strategy. And secondly, how do we stimulate the development of small businesses in Puerto Rico? I think that the CRA investment agreement that opens up qualified investing in Puerto Rico is a solid strategy, but that needs to be, communicated and disseminated around other banks in Puerto Rico and show the opportunity. So I want to start by thanking for those two initiatives, and also inviting the Fed to look at these paradoxes that regions like Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, and it is an interesting contradiction to the extent that while we have maximum employment in the U.S., we are reaching the point of unbearable unemployment in the territories. So thank you so much for that, and thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you very much. We'll go over to Mr. Shande. And excuse me if I didn't pronounce it correctly.
Jonas Shinde. You did well, thank you. My name is Jonas Shinde. I'm the Chief Economist at the Fiscal Policy Institute, and I would like to thank President Williams and Vice Chairman Clarida for hosting these events. I think these are very important events. As far as the two goals, the two mandates, I think they're both supremely important for maintaining the Federal Reserve's credibility. Without price stability, and I think most of us still remember the 80s, the credibility of the Fed was very much questioned, and I think a lot of work was done to bring the price stability under control. However, without the without knowing what is going on in the labor market, without replying to the concerns from the labor market, again, the credibility of the Federal Reserve comes under attack from the other angle. I hope we are going to have some time to speak in some detail about the labor market and about where the labor market is. And I would like to challenge the notion that we have reached or that we are at full employment, especially since the full employment is not very well defined in academic literature. We do not know what it is. It is a very abstract concept, but there are some indicators that we can look at. For instance, we still do not have something that could point to there being a very strong labor market. Things like wage growth, 3.2, 3.4% are just barely okay. So I do not think that the full employment is something that we need to worry about at this point, because the risks of reverting towards higher unemployment are going to be much more widely felt throughout the labor force. And of course, that pain and suffering could put, once again, the credibility of the Federal Reserve under question. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Portes, and then we'll come back.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation, President Williams, for having us here. It was very useful to have the questions sent in advance so that we have a time to reflect about them. This intervention, and maybe closer to the end, I would like to focus on the communication efforts that the Fed has been doing, particularly that comic book about monetary policy and so on. In regard to the dual mandate, the importance lies in an effort of separating for the general public, given that the Fed is now front and center, of the difference between a demand shock and a supply shock, because per se there's no conflict when we're hitting by a demand shock. Now, when there's a supply shock, maybe there's a trade-off what to do with employment or inflation. But in that effort is that I want to emphasize that maybe the policy rule is not as such in a position to be confusing the public or to the self internally, but rather having a clear perspective to the outside world, what matters and what's being done, depending on the nature of the fluctuation.
Thank you. We're going to go to Ms. Weisberg. Is that correct? Thank you. And then Mayor Martin.
Hi, yes. Thank you also for inviting us here. I want to echo what some of my colleagues have said and just hopefully add upon that. Because when we talk about the full unemployment, there's still stark disparities between unemployment, and I think you alluded to it as well, between the black population and white population, Hispanic. Even if you say it's narrowing, we still know it's very stark. And also unemployment, or even full employment, doesn't speak to the wages that people are making and if they're able to afford living, particularly in New York City, which is where I'm speaking from, and who is getting those jobs. So we've done some studies even in the Bronx where over half of the jobs are held by people outside of the Bronx, whereas 2/3 of the Bronx still lives in poverty. And that's just one example. So when we think about full employment, how can the Fed help further equitable employment, equitable economic development, jobs that pay well? I know you spoke at our conference, and I really appreciated you raising some of these issues there. And I'm glad you spoke about the CRA as well. So if there's an opportunity to speak to that, I know that's not specifically this, but as you do oversee banks, when you're evaluating them, making sure that they are contributing to equitable economic development, because plenty of investments might check the box, but is it really furthering the type of growth that we want? So if that's within the scope of this discussion, I wanted to add those pieces.
Thank you. Mr. Levinson, and then Mayor Martin.
Yeah.
Of running a tight labor market for a sustained period of time way outweigh the risks of doing so. I want to argue that it's not even a close call. That in a period, and when I say period, I mean a period of 4 decades, where wages have been stagnant, where wages have lagged behind productivity growth, where workers have decreased bargaining power, where the federal minimum wage is ridiculously, unconscionably low, at a time when global trade has radically expanded, this creates an environment where we need tight labor markets. The benefits of tight labor markets that have been referred to in the introductory comments, real wage gains that noticeably go to lower and middle class workers, that go to African American workers. There's one time in the last 40 years where the average wages of African American workers were actually rose faster than white workers, and that was in the late 90s when we had a period of very low unemployment. And the impact of tight labor markets is not just on earnings, it's also, as we are beginning to see, on labor supply. The traditional perspective, which stems from the 70s, I mean, John Williams was a teenager in the 70s. He probably didn't even know what the Federal Reserve was. Maybe he did because he's very precocious. But it's in a way it's absurd that the gains from tight labor markets, which are widely recognized now, the concern is that it comes at a cost of inflationary pressures. But the relationship between labor markets and inflation is radically changed since then. And I think the Fed has been slow to recognize that. The dynamics between inflation and the tight labor market, are not what they were in the 70s. This is not the 70s. The environment is totally different. Going into the 70s, workers had 2% real wage gains for decades. There was a oil shock that quadrupled the price of oil. Unions were much stronger. Global trade was minuscule compared to what it is today. And so both sides of the equation, both the benefits of tight labor markets, and the risk of inflation are radically different. And let's recognize that. And so the importance of running a tight labor market for a sustained period of time, I would argue, is one of the single most important policy objectives in the United States today. There are other, the Fed isn't the only actor here. We need a much more supportive and aggressive fiscal policy, but the Fed has an important role to play, and we hope it can do that.
Terrific. We're going to go to Mayor Martin in front of me, and then Mr. Raskin afterwards.
Thank you. I would suggest to you that, in fact, some inflation, not wild inflation or wildly unexpected inflation, is actually a good thing. It helps our economy adjust because of the resistance in so many sectors to adjusting prices. And that will, of course, cause some disappointment in certain sectors. Particularly, I think you should be well concerned about the number of people who are retiring without adequate savings, and the risk of inflation will be particularly troublesome to them. But the inflation itself actually, to some degree, provided we're not letting it go to 6 or 7 or 8%, but if we can keep it down in the sub 5, I think it actually helps our economy make the price adjustments it needs to make. Meanwhile, even though we may be approaching a full employment, and we can argue about what full employment is or is not, and we understand that obviously as the unemployment rate gets lower, the marginal advantage changes. But nonetheless, if we have people who aren't employed that could be, there's more work to be done. We can increase the size of the pie if we can take that labor market and put it to good use. And at the same time, I think it will help address the growing income inequality that's going on. So if it was 65-35, it needs to change to 35-65 with more emphasis, like many of the people who I've heard today, put more emphasis on the full employment to extract as much out of our economy as we can by giving people more opportunity to work.
Thank you. These concerns, I run the Greater New York Hospital Association, so we're probably one of the largest employers throughout the New York region, and if you could dovetail that across the United States, healthcare, that is. And we employ the gamut of skills that's known to society. Some entry-level skills, a good friend from SEIU, and we partner with them a lot, to probably the apex of human learning, where you have physicians trained anywhere between 3 to 7 years in residency programs post-MD. So they graduate basically out of their residency at 35, just to start practicing. So the way I look at labor markets, Mark, is not the question of only tight, and I totally agree with you on that. A tight labor market is preferable to any labor market. But fundamentally is the pipeline, the training that goes into it. See, I can't look at this as a static proposition. This is dynamic for me. I have to take a look at this in some cases over decades, or certainly a decade, and try to figure out where the supply is to meet the expected demand as the demographics constantly improve and change. So what am I saying here? I'm just saying that when I look at the labor market questions of full employment, yes, I love full employment, but it is not a static proposition. It is dynamic where I come from. And I have to worry about that supply because the technology that are involved in my industry is amazing. So that's my comments.
Thank you. Mr. Ballone?
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, it is great to be here. I want to thank President, Vice Chairman, and the Fed for doing this. It is very important that there is this outreach, particularly from this agency, which sometimes some have viewed as being a little insular. So the exercise, yeah, I don't know what would make people think that. But it is a really great exercise to be doing this. So I do appreciate it. I would agree with the comments of the mayor on the emphasis given to the two main priorities of the Fed, which of course are both very important. Also to his comments about not believing everything you read in the paper or on the internet, by the way. But I would be interested in the conversation about what the expectations of the Fed are here and what the limits of those are. And with respect to how the Fed deals with, a very rapidly changing environment that is changing more rapidly every day in terms of our global economy and how we grapple with it. And it seems like so many of the issues that have been raised here, which I agree with so many of them, do relate to fiscal policy, do relate to failures of the political system to address important matters. And what is the expectation is, and what is the extent to which the Fed can deal with the political system's inability to deal with rapidly changing circumstances. It's never been great at dealing with changing circumstances, but it seems to be getting worse. And, I think I would be, having been in politics a long time now, I would be concerned about creeping political influence on this institution. I think one of the most important things is that this institution remain out of politics.
Hear, hear. Mr. Kofoed, please.
Thank you. Oh, excuse me. Thank you. And Mike Kofoed, West Point, United States Military Academy, and I should also say that I don't represent the Army nor the DoD. They're very strict that I say that. So, and thank you also, President Williams, and also Heather Daly for putting this together for us. And speaking of insular institutions with my employer, but some comments were made about thinking about the 70s and the 80s and running at full employment. And maybe I'm one of these millennials that don't remember the 70s and 80s, but I read history. So, but my concern, being someone who did graduate from college in 2009, was the idea of a recession. And I think especially many younger workers are worried that we've been growing now for the last 10 years and possibility of a recession around the corner. I know earlier in the year there were talks about that with inverting yield curves that have now not so inverted anymore. But and that's why I would push back. As much as I would like to run the economy hot, especially I think every politician or person that worker would like that to happen. My concern then is as interest rates are still historic lows. If the recession was to happen, would the Fed be able to correspond with expansionary monetary policy with such low inflation numbers? And while, yeah, it would be great to run the employment markets hot, I would always like higher wage growth as well. I think that the inability for the Fed to respond to a financial crisis, especially given the headwinds of the current fiscal situation and political climate, I think that kind of preparation would be very beneficial to ensure the entire economy is not harmed.
Thank you. Ms. Curran?
I think, is this thing on? Can you hear me now? All right, good. In municipal government, we're always looking at sales tax. In Nassau County, it's 40% of our budget. Piggybacking on what Steve said about the political climate and what's going on with the global markets, we're watching very closely the tariff war with China. Will that spark inflation? Will that hurt consumer confidence? That's something that we're looking at very closely.
Thank you. Mr. Sobrino Vega?
Thank you. My name is Christian Sobrino Vega. I'm president of the Puerto Rico Fiscal Agency and Financial Advisory Authority. I would like first to start by saying that both President Williams' team here and a lot of people here around the table have been excellent friends of Puerto Rico over the past few years, and we really appreciate the help and the solidarity that what we've been facing, not only with the hurricane, but with the fiscal situation. And I say that because I am profoundly convinced that many of the fiscal issues that Puerto Rico face will be knocking the door here in the mainland or have already been knocking the door here in the mainland. Regarding the Fed's mission, I hope that this event and others like this can help the Fed go beyond the empire of Excel, where numbers seem to speak for themselves, but they don't really bring down those matters to, back home we call it rice and beans, I think. Up here you call it meat and potatoes, something like that. But how does those things affect the decision-making process of regional and local leaders that have to walk out of the door every day and look in the eye of their constituents? I'll give you an example. Price stability for an island that brings in over 85% of its goods, it's very important. It's life or death. Inflation, when you have a retiree population where their public sector pension went completely unfunded, is now on a pay-go basis, it's very important if there's no cost of living adjustment. These decisions that are maybe taken at the macro level impact the decision-making process at the local and regional level, and I am more than happy to participate here and also to provide what we have been facing from Puerto Rico, because, again, it will be knocking the door up here soon, if it hasn't already. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Koenig, nice transition there.
First, thank you for inviting me. I work for AARP in their Public Policy Institute, and we represent those 50 and older. I struggle a little bit with your first question because we represent those who are still in the labor force as well as those who are retired. So I would say from that perspective, price stability is probably more important for those who are already retired, but for the 50 plus who are still working, tight labor markets help them. And I would point out that it helps them after other groups. And the reason why I say that is because older Americans, workers, do face age discrimination. And what we saw after the financial collapse is that while unemployment was lower for older Americans, the percent that faced long-term unemployment rose substantially. And it remained substantially higher than other age groups. And it wasn't until you had tighter labor markets for an extended period of time where that started to come back down. And so now when you look at the percentage of those older Americans, 50 plus, who are long-term unemployed, it's about what it is for the other age groups. It's a little higher, but it's roughly the same. I would like to also echo this idea of making sure that we have good jobs, because I do think that is critical. One thing that was raised is that we're going through a rapidly changing job market, and so one concern that I would have is training and preparation for that transition. Not clear to me what the Fed's role is, but I think that's something that shouldn't be lost sight of, because we have a lot of older Americans who need to adapt some lifelong training in order to be able to have the skills in order to perform in the job market. And the last thing I would mention is just good jobs include retirement savings. So if you change the ratio, 65-35, and it's more price instability, you need people who can save. And the way they save is by having a retirement plan at work. And so we need to make sure that all workers have access to a retirement savings plan in order to have a nest egg for when they retire.
Thank you. I'd like to take a pause now. If anybody else has any thoughts on the dual mandate, otherwise we should move on and maybe delve a little bit deeper into the job market. Any other thoughts on the dual mandate? Yes, sir.
My name is Oscar Harmon. I'm from the University of Connecticut, and I just wanted to add a academic perspective on this topic. And I appreciated greatly the remarks of Chairman Powell recently about balance sheet and normalization. And it occurred to me in this conversation that that your definition was not with respect to a number. You noticed that it went from 5% to 25% of GDP, and you defined it as being one that could be consistent with price stability, but not as a number. And I think that I was greatly encouraged that could be consistent with being accommodating if there's a demand shock and be accommodating to a fiscal policy that might offset that. I wanted to add that comment. Thank you.
Thank you. So the next, I want to delve a little bit more into the job market. We've talked quite a bit, several of you have talked about the advantages of running a hot or tight job market. Want to see if others had thoughts, perhaps some of your perspectives on what are some of the disadvantages of running a hot or tight job market. Would anybody like to further discuss that issue? Yeah.
And one question in the earlier meetings I think has been very helpful is, what does that mean to you? What does this term hot job market mean to you? Whether if you're a community leader, or whether you're a business leader, whether you're in government, I mean, how do you think about these terms? And we got a lot of economists here. We tend to think about it one way, and I think a lot of these conversations reveal, and I think this has already come up, Mark, and others, that there is no one way to think about this, and I'd like to kind of hear the fuller discussion.
Thank you, John. That got it going. Mr. Levinson, and then Mr. Puppin.
On the question of, and that's a good question. What is a tight labor market? I think I don't know if there's widespread agreement, but there's, I think, widespread acknowledgement that the unemployment rate by itself does not capture tightness in the labor market. We have to look at, labor force participation, but even beyond that, I would argue a tight labor market is characterized by rising wages. When wages are rising above 3.5% in nominal terms, 1.5 real increase plus 2% productivity above that for years, not like reaching it and then pulling back, but running above 3.5% in nominal terms for years. And if wages are rising, and if the labor share of corporate income starts to rise, and Richard Clarida has written about this himself, and the labor share of corporate income tends to rise late in recoveries, well, that should be extended. It doesn't start to rise and then you turn it off. We've had 4 decades of essentially labor suppression in this country. And what a tight labor market means is real wages are rising, the labor share of corporate income starts to turn around, and we should push it. We don't know what the limits are. Really. And policy should push it to see what it is. And if inflation, starts to, reach dangerous territory, which I believe isn't going to happen, for years under such a policy, then you can adjust. But this idea of taking away the punch bowl, it's a, obnoxious metaphor, when wages hit 3.5% is ridiculous. Those should be, I believe, the criteria of what a tight labor market is.
Mr. Papanopoulos.
Yeah, just kind of to add to that, I think the idea of wages going up, there has to be some bargaining power there. I think if you go pre-1980s, union membership was much higher. Today, according to the OECD in the U.S., the national union membership is about 10.6%. So at least in the past, I think with high union memberships, I think labor had much more or greater bargaining power. So during the economy and during the time where they can sit and negotiate higher wages, they were stronger at doing that. So I think the idea of just wages going up on their own due to tight labor markets, I think that's less so today than I think in the past. And I think now the tight labor market or a labor market that is not so tight as well, I think that kind of no longer exists. They're kind of meeting more at the middle now. And I think due to low union membership, I think overall has taken away from the bargaining power and the ability for wages to rise. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Spriggs. And I would also add to this question: if you or the people that you represent, do you feel that wages are beginning to rise on a sustainable basis? So, Mr. Spriggs.
So, to answer your immediate question, no, they're not. What most unions are doing is struggling to make back what they gave during the downturn. So the offset between wage gains and other compensation, ensuring continued contributions either to retirement or to health, pretty much offset the gains that are given on wages. And most of the wage gains really are catch-up, which gets to the point that was being raised that labor share of income is down. At some point, we're going to have to accept that wages have to rise faster than productivity to get labor share back up. And that's just essential to get back to an economy that's more equal. The points I was raising earlier about having unemployment run much higher than in the post-1980 era, much higher than it did before, get to what I think is missing when we are at full employment. When you're at or near full employment, firms are going to spend more money on training. You will not hear them whining, I can't get people who are skilled. This was always the case, that workers needed skills. We went through massive industrial robotization of autos, of coal mining during the 50s and 60s. Workers had to get trained up for these new machines. Companies didn't whine, they trained. So when you hear companies saying, I'm spending more on training, that means we're getting closer. When you don't see the phenomena of hoarding by firms of skilled workers, but you actually see workers transitioning from lower productivity firms to higher productivity firms, and we know that workers are not moving as much between low and high productivity firms, that means you're near full employment, because now firms are far more serious about getting the talent that's out there. When you actually see firms invest, there's no point right now if I'm a firm to invest, because I know the Fed isn't going to let inflation get above 2%. I'm going to tell my workers 2 or 3% sounds good because that's what inflation is going to be. You should be happy with keeping the same real wage. Why do I need a machine to increase productivity? I'm getting unit labor costs to go down by jawboning by workers into lower wages, right? You get unit labor costs down either by making the workers more productive or by saying to them, through jawboning them and being mean and a bully, that take the wage cut or I'm going to go to Mexico, which is what American workers are facing. We shouldn't be surprised we don't see productivity increases. That's not how I have to get productivity and unit labor costs down. So I would say you're at full employment when you return all of the dynamics to the labor market that were there. More turnover, low-wage workers, more workers moving from low-wage firms to high-wage firms to higher productivity levels, more firms spending a lot more time talking about training workers. And the sustainability question is going to be vital. We just heard about this from one of the largest hospital industries in the United States here in New York. They train, they don't whine, they train. They do that with the SEIU. But here's the thing. Those higher skilled workers, those doctors, on Sunday at Morehouse College, everybody missed the whole point. Morehouse College tuition is super low. Everybody's like, why did these students have so much debt? They didn't pay attention to Morehouse tuition. Morehouse tuition is a fraction of private liberal arts education, yet their students are in debt. Why? Because Black and Latino students come from families that have no money. They have no money. And the challenge we have going forward is that was a one-trick pony we just pulled during this last downturn. You ran up student debt to over $1 trillion. You can't do that again. It's not sustainable. You're not going to get the doctors because those 400 Black men who walked across the stage of Morehouse, that's a disproportionate share of those who will become doctors. That level is not going to work, and high interest rates hurt those who have to borrow money. Higher incomes and higher wages on their parents' part means that it's easier for them to finance an education. So I think we've missed all of the components that a full employment get us when you think in the dynamic of the labor market. When you think about investment, when you think about training, when you think about productivity increases, I think we've forgotten all those dynamics that have to be present. And so, yeah, when wages are rising a lot and incomes are going up, and what the Fed is doing is saying the point of a higher interest rate is to slow demand and increase savings, as opposed to lower interest rates mean Americans can buy cars. See, that's wrong. Lower interest rate policy should not be so Americans can buy a car and run up $1 trillion in auto debt. Lower interest rates should be for something different. But you understand you wouldn't have had the car industry return if Americans didn't have low interest rates so they could borrow. That tells you I'm not at full employment.
Thank you. Mr. Colon, and then we'll keep it moving.
Thank you. And I am Nelson Colon. I forgot to introduce myself in the first round. From the Puerto Rico Community Foundation, President and CEO. And I want to translate meat and potatoes into rice and beans. It's good, right? So, of course, rising wages in Puerto Rico is perhaps one of the most potent stimulus to retain workers in the island. However, that particular economy has three very significant variables. One is it is a shrinking labor market. The most productive people in Puerto Rico are living the island. Secondly, it's an aging labor market. 59% of labor market participants are over 55 or over. So that's another challenge there. And thirdly, the very dynamics of migration. So I'm just saying that as a framework to invite the Fed to consider what is somewhere in the writings that were sent to us, to consider the sectorial economies. Which basically, when you look at maximum employment and you look at the territories, you look at Black families in the U.S., you look at Latino families in the U.S., those numbers translate into a very different challenge. So that's one. And secondly, just to suggest, what I found is one of the most important resources of the Fed is information. So just having the opportunity to deal with and wrestle with some of these very specific dynamics that respond to very specific markets will be of great use, at least for us in Puerto Rico.
Thank you. Ms. Weisberg?
Hi, yes, thank you. I apologize, I'm not an economist, so I'm speaking more from the experiences that our members have. But a few things that I'm just wrestling with here is agreed on the union, the lack of the decline in unions is certainly an issue. We also have a lot of entrepreneurs that it's the different type of economy, right? So when you're self-employed, you're not bargaining for higher wages, but you're facing very serious challenge in rising rents, not being able to purchase property. So the impact of land use policy, speculation, warehousing of space, all of that really affects the wages of the entrepreneur and what they're able to pay their workers. Of course, we definitely want all businesses to pay livable wages, not just not just minimum wage, but living wages that they can survive and thrive in New York City, which is extremely expensive. But these are challenges that many small businesses are facing, in addition to access to capital, as you mentioned before. And I don't quite know where the Fed's policy falls on that, but in terms of information and studies and amplifying that message, having land use set aside, say, for manufacturing businesses, which we know is one with lower barriers to entrance and can pay a higher wage than, say, a retail job, particularly one that's not unionized, is really important. But if the space isn't there to do so, and that's just one industry, but how you can look at, I know you've done some of those studies, but look at industries that pay better wages and foster that. It's more nuanced than simply economic policy, right? And the labor market per se, particularly as folks are talking about the supply of workers and training. I'm pleased to hear talking about companies training, but you also need programs that are going to foster and encourage that, to make sure that all these training programs are leading to jobs, because there's a lot of training programs out there that don't necessarily have a job in place. So I think all of that will affect the quality of the labor market.
Thank you, Mr. Shende.
Thank you. Of course, as we talk about the Federal Reserve's work, we need to know that, of course, that it needs to be said that the interest rate is a blunt tool, and it cannot really address every single concern, especially if the expansionary monetary policy by the Fed is offset or partly offset by the austerity policies by the Congress and the state governments. So, for instance, the state of New York has the austerity policy for a while, and the state of New York has been constrained without any statutory requirements by the 2% spending growth gap. So, of course, that inhibits some of the expansionary dynamics here. But if we talk about the labor market, of course, there have to be some very clear indicators that something is moving in the right direction. One of those things, of course, is inequality. Inequality in New York State is the most unequal state in America. Inequality has to move somewhere. It needs to move in the right direction. We are approaching the Gilded Age level of income inequality. That's one. Second, we're looking at a very slow wage growth at the bottom. Now, of course, at the bottom we have the $15 minimum wage, so that helped a little bit. So it's not a market. Market situation. It's a policy. It's a conscious policy by the state government. Now, the rest of the incomes aren't growing quite as fast, and to reach the level where we are going to say that the labor market is particularly tight, we need to see sustained a growth of wages above productivity, because then we can say that there is some real competition for labor. And at this point, we cannot say that there is any competition for labor. What companies are talking about, and they're talking about this all the time, look at us, and we have all these openings, about 2 million more openings than positions filled, and then of course there's 0.8 workers per each job opening out there, and they still complain. They complain about the skill gap. Now, the skill gap, it's been discussed for a while, is a very overblown phenomenon. What this is, I think, it's just the aftermath of the Great Recession. And the employers are very spoiled by the fact that I do not know if you were. I was on the job market with my PhD at right after the Great Recession, and employers were just looking at workers just throwing themselves at any job randomly, competing for scraps and competing for the types of wages that they wouldn't accept normally. So employers are still waiting for that because they had they had a really good time. Employees are still stuck, and a lot of them are underplaced with respect to their skill level. So they're not changing their jobs. They're not looking for a new job because, again, they're scared. Because if one recession hit and they hit them really hard, then the next one is going to happen. So they are not looking for new jobs. They're not moving. They're not economically dynamic, not very mobile. And that, of course, that is where the skill gap is coming from. So if we just up the interest rate, well, then again, that is going to stop employers from hiring, and they're going to just sit there on their money. Now, of course, the money has been very cheap, right? Last year, we had the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, so both fiscal policy and monetary policy. What are the employers doing? Here's the money. Take it, invest. And as a result of last year, we have the record stock buybacks. So they're not investing. They don't want these workers. So the job market is not really tight. Also, if we look at the unemployment rate, and this is the last point I will make, how much slackness is in the unemployment rate? If we look at the EPOP, the employment to population ratio, we'll look at this quite often, and what we see the older workers, the EPOP for them is going up and up and up and up and up. So, of course, now why is that? Well, because the older workers who've been hit by the Great Recession significantly, they're looking for a job, and they're very good employees. They're not asking for a raise. You can hire them, and they will just sit there and occupy that position for a while. So, if they get a job, then they are employed, and if they don't get a job, then they are just retired. So, how much slackness is there? Now, the situation, in my opinion, it could get much worse, because right now we are in the midst of the demographic transition. And a lot of the baby boomers, as they are retiring, they're leaving significant gaps in the labor market. And those gaps you will have to fill those gaps with a lot of untrained people who haven't had the experiences, who haven't had the exposure to the type of positions which they would occupy and hold and where they would work if the economy was normal. So how much thought is given to the tightness of the labor market? I think it's very important to just sit there and I think one conversation is not going to resolve this issue. But it is important to sit and think, what are the indicators of the tightness of the labor market? So the blank statements like this, they wouldn't be made, because it raises a lot of questions about what kind of thinking goes into establishing where the tightness of the labor market is going to be. That's all.
Thank you. Mr. Rasky, and I'd also reiterate the second part of the question, which is, are you seeing any wage growth or demand for wage or pressure on the wage side?
Well, I have a very simple and practical definition of a tight labor market, and the corollary would be on wage growth. And you have achieved it when jobs creation is not an election issue. Very simple. And when that stops, you know you've achieved it. So we'll see.
Very good. Mayor Martin.
So a little anecdotal information. My daughter just got a degree in data analytics, and she's not too worried about getting a job. I would call that a hot labor market. I think she should be more worried than she is, but sometimes they don't listen to Dad, although I told her data analytics would be a good investment in her own education. And maybe that's the definition, in a way, of what a tight labor market is, which is not seen in the unemployment number. It is seen in what percentage of people are voluntarily leaving their current employment in order to get another job. And to me, that's the measure of a tightness. And I will tell you that employers then, and this is kind of, and I can't figure out the yin and the yang, but I was the senior partner of a small firm. And when things got tight, we got nervous about what were we going to have to do to keep our employees. Interestingly enough, for our employees, the advancement of their skills was in fact one of the benefits that they got from the firm. So we invested more in that, as well as other benefits, as well as other salaries. But the complication of investment in skills for a firm that might then lose the employees is a complicated dynamic. I will say in passing, one of the things I'm worried about with the huge college debt that now exists, that some of which may be based upon our recession in 2008, 2009, where a lot of people left the labor market and ran to the education front. I am concerned that some of our institutions of higher learning are in fact appealing to young people who are not making, if I could use this word, rational decisions about how much they're spending on education for how important it is for the skills that they get on the backside. Just as my daughter apparently, according to her, has lots of job opportunities, there's any number of young people with degrees that I'm not certain I would ever hire, and they're wondering why they're sitting there with $50,000 to $100,000 of college debt and can't find jobs to pay it. And I would say that we've got to change our orientation. I'm very, very pro getting skills and college education, et cetera, but I'm not certain that it immediately translates to a growing economy. It, in fact, is almost a consumption good for some individuals, and somehow we need to change that understanding. To your last question, I'm the chief administrative officer as well as the mayor of the city of Stamford. Roughly 98, 99% of my employees are unionized. We are, the cost of defined benefit plans being much larger than what anybody ever expected or whatnot. We've tried to move away from that, as most other employers have. But I am beginning to see the tightness of the labor market, and it's not broadly, but it is in very specialized positions that have unique requirements, and whether it's training for some certificate, I'm beginning to see that within that union structure, I've got some jobs that are hard to fill at the salaries, and it's not easy to bring in people and then train them due to my civil service or union regulations, and it's unconscionably expensive to raise everybody's salary because I've got 15 or 20 positions that I'm having a hard time filling. But it is beginning to happen.
Interesting. Thank you. Ms. Doucette.
Thank you. I just wanted to touch on a couple of things that have already been said, but just more anecdotally that we're hearing from our constituents. One, on the issue of the pipeline training. We've been really encouraged as we've gone out talking to a lot of our universities and community colleges in particular with some of the really constructive conversations that are happening between them and sort of outreach to the employers in our region to have conversations about what the skills are that they need and really looking forward proactively into kind of what the future of work looks like and what they need, both in terms of 4-year degrees, certificate programs, 2-year degrees. So we hope to help facilitate some of that as well, because I think that's going to be a really important piece moving forward. Secondly, on the issue of full employment, I think what we see in our area, which, as you were saying as well, has a very high cost of living, we hear from a number of our constituents who are employed but are needing to work 2 or 3 jobs in order to meet the cost of living requirements in the areas that that we're servicing to really just meet the very basic needs of their families. And so I think when you talk about full employment, sort of taking that piece into account is really important.
Thank you, Mr. Kofoed, and then we'll come.
Thank you. And in full disclosure, I'm not a monetary economist. I'm actually an education economist, so I got really excited about some of the comments about student debt, about college, and the skills pipeline. A lot of the student debt that we're finding is because of the Great Recession, states and localities began to divest from higher education, which then drove up the tuition costs, and particularly our public universities and community colleges. My own research that's been published shows that during recessions, students and parents start to shift towards student loans because the financial ability of states and localities begins to disappear. And during expansion, student loan balances begin to decline because now states like Tennessee with Tennessee Promise or localities like Kalamazoo, Michigan can offer these benefits again to their students. And a corollary, my co-author on that paper looked at major choice. And for example, during recessions, people tend to pick what you would maybe call skills major, and during expansions, people tend to pick what the mayor called maybe consumption-style majors. Data analytics is not one of those, so I think you're okay with your daughter. But what I worry then about is what role does the Federal Reserve, since that's what we're here, have to do with the education markets? Because everything we've cited here isn't a monetary aspect, but rather it's a fiscal aspect. That goes back to counties and cities and states. And this kind of goes back to the concern possibility of a future recession, if the Fed doesn't have that ability to lower interest rates when students are going to need that student loan because of the lack of fiscal support, then I think students get backed into a corner where today they can rely on various other aspects to pay for college rather than student loans. For example, expanding Pell Grants or expanding city and localities. And then raising rates might now not be as harmful as if we hit a recession and the need for student loans is increased. There's a lot of debate on whether student loans could be a somewhat good thing. Maybe students, because the average student isn't as high as what you read in the media, maybe perhaps in a recession it's good for students to take on some of those loans. So as was mentioned with Morehouse College, they're able to go to college, and we would want that interest rate to be low during the recession rather than low during the expansion on the college markets.
Thank you. I would like us to move on to inflation unless somebody else wants to chime in.
Can I use my prerogative as a host or chair or whatever I am? So I've got, one of our members of our board of directors, so I want to put him on the spot. So Vinny Alvarez, there's been a lot of discussion around unions and about real wages and negotiating and all that. I'd like to hear your perspective on that.
Sure. Well, thank you, Mr. President. I was deferring to some of my colleagues who are here. But one of the things which jumped out at me when you started the discussion and said, how is the economy doing? How are wages doing? And then Mark jumped in and said, he defines it pretty practically. I think a lot of our folks do, which is, are they working and are they making? Certainly, are they working? Are there jobs, and how are those jobs, and how are those jobs paying, and what does it ultimately mean for the economic well-being of themselves, their families, and ultimately their communities? And I think that sometimes there's this disconnect that we see, and we don't always take into account when it comes to wages, because we are seeing slight wage growth, but it's nowhere near making up for the years and the decades, really decades of losses, that it's not taken into account. Also, what is left in their pockets at the end of the week, what is left in their paychecks at the end of the week because of the pressures that they were feeling, in particular with health care and the out-of-pocket expenses that they're paying and the high cost of deductibles and co-insurance and as well as funding their retirement security. Gary and I, just prior to the meeting, talked about this lack of retirement security, what it means not only for the economic well-being for workers, but also for municipalities. Here in New York City, that has some of the highest union density in the country, 1 in 4 workers are unionized, yet 65% of all workers in New York City have no form of retirement security whatsoever, no traditional defined benefit or defined contribution plan. So I think that yes, we have to certainly look at wages, but there is also a much broader disconnect about ultimately the economic well-being of workers, and then there is certainly a degree, and I appreciate all the comments about how ultimately the question of power in the workplace and the relationship between employers and diminishment of worker power in this country over the past several years, and how that has, I think, impacted ultimately the economic well-being of workers. We're seeing that, as well as other things too, and other factors, the rise of the contingent workforce, and how that is having an impact on them. Well, so I think that here in New York, we have this paradox, because we do have this high level of unionization in New York City, in the 5 boroughs of New York City, yet we have the highest inequality that we see anywhere throughout the country, or some of the highest, certainly. So, ultimately, what we're doing here, and we're talking about things like inflation and things like maximum employment, and how that is going to impact in a way that can be positively felt by the workforce, certainly in this city, is I think we have to look at the end of the day, what is the income security or lack of security, in many cases income insecurity of families, working families throughout the city, and then we can start to understand why there is this tremendous polarization. And then what comes after polarization potentially in this country could be, in the most dire sense, social unrest, which is something that we want to avoid. We saw glimpses of that after the Great Recession, not far from these doors with the Occupy movement, and people were really pushing back on some of the things which are taking place in this country. So these are big questions. But for everyday working people, they're very, very practical reality. How am I doing? How is my family doing? And then what can these big forms of institutions in government like the Federal Reserve do to help us in these very, very, very broad concepts that they hear about? But they certainly want to understand on a practical level for them and their families. I have two kids that graduated from college. I'd say just recently, one 3 years ago and one 3 weeks ago. And I said, I never had a student loan in my life. I now have student loans. So there's also an impact that it's having on families today, because families quite often are having to step up. And fortunately, we're able to do it. As Bill said, some families are not able to do it, but we have to step up and do something that we can to help provide for our children in a way, and give them hopefully a head start. And then they'll be working, right, Mayor, as we say, and we don't have to provide for them much longer. So I think there's a lot of, and I have many of them coming back. So I think there's a lot of questions that we have to do as to determine how working people on an everyday basis are doing. And we can't just look at what the unemployment rate is, what inflation is, and there are so many other broader factors that we have to take into consideration.
Thank you. Let's move on to inflation. Would love to. First question I would ask is how concerned are people around this table and the folks that you represent with inflation, and any thoughts that you have on that more broadly? Yes, Mr. Spriggs.
Yeah, I apologize. I'm going to cut out before the 2:45. So thank you for calling on me just there. We're not concerned with inflation. We don't see it. We see consistently the economy has taken seriously what the Fed has said about its target. That credibility is great. It has a downside to it, however. When we look at the debt that's outstanding globally, it is not possible for the lenders of the world to be repaid in real terms the current debt level. When we think back to other periods when we have seen this, post-World War II, the United States had a huge debt from World War II and from the Korean War. A good share of that debt was retired through inflation. That was our magic bullet in order to get that debt retired. We could not have retired that debt in real terms. We would still be paying that debt today if we had repaid it totally in real terms. We feel this because a large share of our workers in the retail sector have been victims to what we consider to be not very sound policies on the part of people not too far from here, who have burdened lots of retailers with huge amounts of unsustainable debt, and much of that debt quality is going down. This concerns us greatly because when Toys R Us or others go bankrupt, it's the workers who end up having to pick up that share. And so I think we need to put the whole discussion of inflation, again, within this broader context of outstanding debt on the part of consumers. The Fed pays a lot of attention to whether it creates a threat to the financial system. It is unlikely that the trillions of dollars in auto debt would bring down the banking system. But remember, auto sales peaked some months ago. Your bank here runs the center that monitors this, and you know that we're running record levels of delinquency on auto loans. This should make everyone pause. How can you have unemployment so low for so long, and you have delinquent auto loans? This is a warning sign. First, I think you should have been paying attention to the subprime loans and their conditions, and that's why you have delinquencies. You let them engage in predatory behavior, and the delinquencies are coming from that predatory behavior. But more importantly, in the real economy, since we worry about auto workers, if those delinquencies lead to a lot of repossessions, flooding the market with used cars at this point in time when the auto market already is weak is not a good thing for auto workers, which means it's not a good thing for the United States. So it's not going to bring down the banks, but there is a real economy and there are real consequences. So the ability of people to repay their debts, unfortunately, has become more important. The ability of corporations in this environment where we don't have we have too many firms that are staving off the wolf by borrowing money. The debt burden has to be thought through seriously. So many people believe I am saving everybody because inflation seems to be like a broadly shared tax. The Fed has to get serious. Inequality is a broadly shared tax. The level of inequality that we currently run the economy is not sustainable because the market driving forces that we depend on, people buying cars, forming families, having kids, the churn in the housing market, all of those things don't work at high levels of inequality. New firm formation doesn't happen at high levels of inequality because you're not generating enough new customers domestically. So I think you shouldn't just have in your minds inflation as a broadly shared tax. This level of inequality is a broadly shared tax on our economy.
Thank you. Mr. Koenig?
So I will get to your question about inflation. I do want to just mention, because someone talked about using the employment rate. The employment rate has been flat. So if you look at it for older workers, 55 plus, pre-recession till today, it's gone up by 1 percentage point. For those 25 to 54, it's been flat. So by one metric, in terms of whether it's a tight labor market, that may be an indication that there's still slack there to be had. On the inflation, so for our constituents, I would say they don't have concerns about inflation. It's been flat for quite some time. I think the expectation is it will continue to be, given the Fed's policy. I do want to make a plea for research, though, because there is this push to go to the chain CPI. It's been done for the tax code. The administration is pushing it to use the chain CPI for welfare, measuring the poverty level, which then will have implications for programs. There's talk about using it for Social Security. The one thing that I don't think we understand about the chain CPI, so economic theory would say, yes, people substitute when relative prices change. It makes perfect sense. I'm not a macroeconomist, but I'm a microeconomist, and yes, it makes perfect sense, okay? But in reality, I think there's a lack of understanding in terms of who has the ability to substitute. So if you live in a low-income neighborhood, do you have the same ability to substitute? Or if you are on a fixed income, do you have the same ability? So I think there is just a research need that would be great for the Fed to fill. I don't think the BLS is quite doing it, to understand to what extent people can substitute when relative prices change.
Since we have you, I'm going to just direct one of the questions directly to you, related to rate policy since the financial crisis and how it's affected retirees. It's similar to the inflation, but very specific to retirees or those living on a fixed income. If you can talk a little bit about how rate policy has affected that segment of the folks that you represent.
So I would say it's mixed. So rate policy, low interest rates have a couple of different effects. So if in a low return environment, people need to save more in order to achieve a standard of living when they retire. Low interest rates also have the effect of
for those who still have access to a defined benefit plan, and so there's a lot in our constituents who actually still have access to a defined benefit plan, you have a lot of employers that are now offering the option of a lump sum. And so when the discount rate is low, it drives people to more likely to take a lump sum, despite the fact that it's probably not in their best interest, may not understand longevity risk, and that it's really not a good deal. So those would be the two points I would make.
Thank you. Ms. Weisberg?
Just building off what the gentleman down there was saying, when we're looking at the debt that's being taken on, I'm also wrestling with how do you couple this with policies that encourage responsible lending, right? Predatory products is almost separate from the interest rates, even though they're related, of course. But if you're flooding the market with predatory products that are targeting Black and Latino low-income families or families of any income, that's going to ultimately affect the economy because we know why. We've seen the repercussions of that. So I'm trying to wrestle with how the policies here impact it. So, for example, like with low interest rates, might make homeownership more feasible. Also, in addition with the equity that you were talking about, or inequity rather, there still is redlining. There still is actually like discrimination in the housing market, small business market. We've seen study after study. So low interest rates could actually help some of these same families or business owners get a loan today, but they're not able to because the banks aren't necessarily making those loans. So I'm just wondering what the Fed's role is in that piece of it, while also looking at the interest rate level, right? Or also in terms of bridging that the income gap, folks that maybe could afford a mortgage but can't afford the down payment because they just don't have the funds. Or somebody was talking about student debt, down there. So again, I wrestle with how this all plays together. Interest rates do matter. Of course they do. I'm not an economist, so I'll let somebody else speak to exactly how, but I do know that a low interest rate could actually help somebody buy a home and build wealth. But if you don't have access to that home for down payment, or because you're actually just not being loaned to because you live in the wrong neighborhood, because somebody has decided that's the wrong neighborhood, that's hugely problematic. And I think that given your research role and other roles that the Fed plays, you can continue to be instrumental in that aspect of it, while also looking at the dual mandate you have.
Mr. Sobrino Vega?
Thank you. Inflation for municipal and local government is critical based on if you are doing any medium to long-term planning on what your costs are going to be at payroll, at OPEX, at capital investment. If you get your inflation assumption wrong and you're stuck into a long-term plan like Puerto Rico is under Promesa that has a 30-year fiscal plan, if that inflation number is higher than what was actually included in the plan, you might re-enter a structural imbalance that affects your debt restructuring, that affects what type of decisions you make with your employees. So I'll give you an example. The payroll expenditure for Puerto Rico is essentially frozen for the next 30 years. It can only be adjusted for inflation. So if that number is wrong, in 10 years, future governments in Puerto Rico might be faced with a situation where they have to decide that to provide a very well-earned payroll increase to a certain group of employees, they need to lay off another group. What does that mean for services? And budgets are becoming tighter across the nation because of healthcare inflation, which does not keep pace with CPI. In Puerto Rico alone, from 2007 to now, prices have gone up 20%. In the healthcare sector, it's 50%. But Puerto Rico has a capped Medicaid plan. So what does that mean for a future government if there is not a permanent solution to our Medicaid program? It means that you have to keep facing these tough decisions that might create structural imbalances, that might create a diminution in the provision of essential services. Inflation also affects our real estate industry. After the Great Recession, Puerto Rico's real estate did not recover to the same level that the U.S. mainland did. So any changes in inflation and interest rates might have a sector that right now is only improving in the high luxury level, but is showing signs at the middle and lower income levels. If interest rates or inflation are off, it's going to kick that recovery in the knees. And also, from the point of view of what government or what local governments decide to invest, to Mr. Kofod, sorry, I didn't mispronounce your name, a point on investing in education and training and other types of reforms, that affects what type of investment you can do, be it by financing or on a pay-as-you-go basis. So for municipal and local government, inflation and interest rates are critical for long-term responsible fiscal decision-making.
A number of people have asked how we're using all of this beyond the framework. I would like to comment on that just very briefly because so many people have asked this question. So as people have pointed to, the Fed does a lot more than monetary policy. Community Reinvestment Act was mentioned a number of times, or working community development, other efforts that we do. So one of the things that I take away from this, and our staff does around this room, as part of these dialogues we have is, sure, we're thinking today about monetary policy frameworks and price stability, maximum employment, setting interest rates, which is, yes, a blunt tool. But we're also, when we think about that, we want to understand what's driving the economy, what's pushing the economy up or down, and what's its long-run growth prospects. All the questions we talked about here about productivity, education, training, skills mismatch, or incentives to invest or not, or incentives to move jobs into other countries. All these things are part of the analysis that we're continuously doing to understand where the economy is, where it's going, and what's longer run prospects are. But there's also these other topics like understanding in the bank supervision arena about predatory lending or other activities under Community Reinvestment Act, community development, understanding what's happening in our communities and how our policies and our activities in those areas can actually address more directly the effects of income and wealth inequality, the effects of gentrification and dislocation in various communities. So just rest assured that even though sometimes these conversations may be feeling like, well, what does monetary policy have to do with this? It actually, first of all, I think it does have something to do with monetary policy, but it also helps us when we think about a lot of our other mandate goals outside of monetary policy.
So I want to keep on the topic of inflation, see if folks had other thoughts. It does sound like having a predictable and stable inflation is important. I'm wondering if some of the other municipalities represented, local government, would share. Do you share the same view? Mayor Martin.
Being very selfish. If I can get all of my unions agreed to a certain wage inflation, and we're issuing 2 sets of bonds, I think we'll be done by early July. So until then, I want inflation expectations to be 0. But by July 15th or 20th, you can rise them to 10%. Now that is selfish, but I would tell you something else. Back in the 80s, 90s, 70s, I don't know, get the data out and see. When inflation was coming down, the municipalities or anyone else was issuing bonds that had a certain inflation built in. And in fact, they were paying the price of that. And now when we have very low inflation baked into most of our offerings, to have a slightly rising inflation rate would actually help the municipalities in real terms. Politically, groups will get very upset about any sort of change. So there will be a political repercussion, but I believe a slightly rising inflation is actually going to help municipality, county, and state debt, which all has a baked-in inflation rate now that's been pretty low for the past number of years. And while this is about inflation, I would go back and say the 2 biggest problems not the 2 biggest, but 2 of the biggest problems are, one, the growing inequality. And I would tell you, outside the Fed's responsibility, a lot of that connects to the marginal rate of income taxes, which have changed dramatically since the 50s and 60s, and I think we've been going in the wrong direction. The other factor is the amount of debt that is carried by the municipalities, the counties, and the states, as well as the baby boomers who are retiring with no savings. Those are the 2 big issues, and now we start talking about jobs and everything else. And I would say the biggest issue is that the job market, the workforce 5 to 10 years from now is going to be very different than it is now. And my most salient example is autonomous vehicles. So within 5 years, will autonomous vehicles basically obliterate the trucking market as we know it today? How many jobs are going to be in excess? And there are people who will immediately say, we need to protect those jobs. No, that's the wrong answer. But we're going to have to start thinking about the fact that our ability to advance technology it's reached a point where this pace of change and the size of change and how it impacts people is going to be enormous, both politically as well as in real terms. And I don't have the answers to any of that. I know that some people are beginning to talk about guaranteed incomes as part of the income tax for individuals regardless of their jobs, because their jobs are all going to be disappeared. But it's complex. I read somewhere, maybe true, maybe not, that it's easier to computerize most of the jobs that lawyers hold today because wills and trusts and stuff are pretty routine, whereas it's harder to figure out how to get a robot to load a dishwasher. So I think that all the people with law degrees are going to become loading dishwashers. I don't know, but I would tell you those are the really big problems, is the debt, the inequality, and the very changing nature of the job market itself. And if the Fed can figure out even half of that, more power to you.
Yes.
Thank you. In my opinion, of course, the inflation is a very important concern, and it's very important a concern for municipalities and Puerto Rico and those who are on fixed income. But we need to balance that concern somehow with the needs of the borrowers. We have about 40 million student borrowers who borrowed, so that's the population. And the amount of debt that they have accumulated at the existing rates of interest appears to be basically unpayable, and a significant portion of such borrowers are ethnic minorities, low-income people. So they're going to be basically stuck if interest rates go up and if inflation is kept low and if the job prospects are the way they are now and if the job market doesn't tighten considerably. So how to balance these concerns with the need for the borrowers to breathe a little bit easier? Well, in the 70s, the late 70s, I think, we had inflation, and I think it's a very simple textbook example, and most of you know, that most of the borrowers who borrowed then, they received this kind of a once-in-a-lifetime bonus of inflation. And that made them, it enabled them to enjoy their lives and their incomes and put their incomes to better use in the 80s and throughout the 90s. Now, if we talk about the borrowers who are with the student loans, with the all sorts of payday loans, and people borrow because of income instability, because of income volatility, and a lot of student loans who were borrowed. Were not borrowed to pay for school, but they were borrowed to sustain those students and keep them and pay their rents, et cetera, et cetera. So dollar for dollar, we're looking at a lot of money that is taken from our economy if these borrowers who are low income and in significant numbers, if they're not able to pay back that debt, if they have to commit a significant portion of their incomes to paying these debts that are going to be unsustainable. So inflation, if it's predictable and if income growth keeps pace with inflation in a predictable manner, could be potentially beneficial.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, Mr. Levinson.
I would just say very simply, my concern has been that inflation is too low. It's been too low for an extended period of time. And again, this concern, the idea that wage-driven price inflation is somehow going to emerge out of the bottle is virtually non-existent. And for a lot of the reasons stated, I mean, this is such a bizarre discussion. Again, it goes back to the 70s. The world has changed. And inflation has been too low, and, we need to act accordingly.
Yes, Mr. Papanikolaou. I'm so sorry.
No, Papanikolaou is fine. Just to kind of, I think the common theme here is that we keep hearing the word income inequality. There's also wealth inequality that I think hasn't been talked about, which is actually worse than income inequality. And I think the Fed is in the near future is going to have a dilemma, what to do with the debt crisis. And I think inflation, if it's thinking about raising rates down the road, I think it's going to come head on with the issue of debt. We have mortgage debt, home equity debt, credit card debt, student loan debt that was brought. And I looked at the delinquency rates during the Great Recession and current 2019 quarter one, and they're starting to creep up to look almost side by side. That's the first thing. Another thing is that credit card interest rates. In 2018, Americans paid banks $113 billion in credit card interest. So I think, again, the idea of looking at inflation, the issue, again, that the Fed's going to have is how is it going to deal with the debt crisis using its monetary tools, trying to deal with, trying to raise inflation. And again, I think that's going to be a difficult task moving forward.
Thank you. We're running very short on time. I think it might be a good place to end. I think, John, you wanted to say a few words.
Sure. First of all, yes, you're right. It's for the academics in the room. Yes, I'm going to answer every criticism of the paper. No, but first of all, this has been terrific conversation, dialogue. I mean, I think if you ask me what we're trying to accomplish here, it's really an ongoing dialogue, not just Rich Clarida, Vice Chair Clarida's efforts at leading the Fed to think about this specific issue about the monetary policy framework, but an ongoing dialogue about our goals. How do we define them? How do we understand them? How do they change over time? Or understanding change? A lot of people have pointed out that the economy is constantly changing, the global economy, the financial system. Well, we actually, we're fully aware of that because in our position, we see those changes happening, whether they're in the Phillips curve relationships, whether in how employers respond to different changes in the economy. So I think this dialogue helps us quite a bit in thinking through the more practical, maybe right on the ground level aspects of this, but also just understanding different perspectives. Okay, so I'm going to go to the 70s, Mark. So since, yes, I was a teenager in the 70s, and it was a period of stagflation. This was a period of very high inflation and high unemployment and low growth. So I did grow up in that period, and that is the thing that we want to avoid all three. So I'm very sympathetic to many of the things that people said today. But, there is the things we do know is high inflation does hurt low and moderate income households, families. A lot of volatility in the economy, high unemployment obviously is bad. So we want to keep unemployment low. We want to keep a strong labor market. We want to keep inflation low. We want to try to do all of these things the best we can. And, one of the things that we have learned along the way, if you look at our, as Vice Chair Clarida said, but this is also true, he was talking about private sector economists, but it's true of Fed economists. We've changed our view on how low unemployment can get without creating inflation. And I think that's a great thing for the U.S. economy, the fact that this is an economy that clearly can operate at roughly 3.5% unemployment rate without creating inflation. That's good. I mean, I like that economy, one with very low unemployment. If you had asked many of us 10 years ago, could we have unemployment, in the low threes and that still be consistent with a sustainable economy? I think many people would say, no, that's not. And today I think, that's getting to be more and more realistic and reasonable. So we're going to continue this dialogue. I really appreciate everyone bringing their best views and perspectives and willingness to be, very thoughtful around these issues. And our commitment, I think speaking for all of us, is to do our very best for the U.S. economy, not only in the short run, but honestly in the longer run, because we want to sustain this expansion, keep job growth strong, keep the unemployment rate broadly defined, not just U3 or U6 or anything, low, and achieve our goals the best we can. And that's what this review is really about. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. I will say that if you have other thoughts, once you leave this room and have had a chance to digest related to these questions, please feel free to email them to us, and they will be incorporated into the final summary. So thank you again. Thank you all for making the time, truly. Thank you.